Lisa had always prided herself on her work ethic. As the new marketing manager at a mid-sized tech firm, she often stayed late at the office to ensure everything was perfect. The building was located in a quiet part of town, and as the clock approached midnight, the streets outside would be deserted, leaving the office eerily silent. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she found it calming. But that night, something was different. It was a Friday, and everyone else had left hours ago to enjoy the weekend. Lisa had a big presentation on Monday and wanted to get everything ready. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the large, open office space. She sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard, completely absorbed in her work. The quietness of the office had always been a sanctuary, but as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the growing unease that crept over her. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise. It was subtle, almost like the creaking of a floorboard, but in an office with thick carpeting that shouldn't have been possible. Lisa froze, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She listened intently, but the sound didn't come again. Shrugging it off as her imagination, she returned to her work. A few minutes later, the sound came again, louder this time, like something or someone was moving slowly through the office. Lisa's heart began to race. She stood up and looked around the dimly lit office. Rows of empty desks stretched out before her, illuminated only by the glow of her computer screen and the few overhead lights that were still on. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. "Is someone there?" Lisa called out, her voice echoing through the empty office. Silence answered her. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid. But as she sat back down, the air felt heavy, charged with an almost tangible sense of dread. Lisa tried to focus on her work, but the unease gnawed at her. The creaking noise came again, closer this time. She grabbed her phone and checked the time. Nearly 1 a.m. She needed to leave, but the idea of walking through the dark, empty office terrified her. Gathering her courage, Lisa stood up, intending to grab her things and go. As she reached for her coat, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the office into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled for her phone to use as a flashlight. Her breathing quickened, and her hands trembled as she swiped the screen, trying to bring up the light. Just as she managed to turn on the flashlight, she heard a whisper, a soft, raspy voice that seemed to come from the shadows behind her. "You shouldn't be here." Lisa spun around, her phone's light cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. She pointed the light toward the back of the office where the sound had come from and saw something that made her blood run cold. In the far corner, near the supply closet, a shadowy figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to blend into the darkness. The figure didn't move, but stood there, watching her. Lisa's mind raced. She was alone in the office. There was no way someone else could be there. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Gathering every ounce of strength, Lisa forced herself to move. She backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on the figure. As she did, the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, like smoke dispersing in the air. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness behind. Lisa didn't wait to see if it would return. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She practically flew down the stairs, not daring to look back. The building was deathly silent as she reached the ground floor and sprinted out the front doors into the cool night air. When she finally reached her car, she locked the doors and sat there, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't know what she had seen, but it had been real. As she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that the shadowy figure was lurking just beyond the reach of her headlights. For the rest of the weekend, Lisa tried to convince herself it was just a hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But when she returned to work on Monday, she found it impossible to go back to her routine. The office felt different, darker, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every small noise set her on edge. A few days later, she found out why. One of her co-workers, an older man named Frank, noticed her jumpiness and asked if she was okay. Reluctantly, Lisa told him about her experience that night, expecting him to laugh it off. But instead, Frank's face grew pale. "That's not the first time someone's seen something here," he said quietly. Years ago, before this company moved in, this building was a psychiatric hospital. It closed down after a series of incidents. Some people say the spirits of the patients never left. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors about the building's history but had never taken them seriously. Now she couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth. She quit her job a week later, unable to bear another night in that haunted office. But the shadowy figure she had seen never left her mind. Even now, she sometimes catches glimpses of it in the corners of dark rooms, in reflections in windows, always watching, always waiting. Ethan was a security guard at an old, sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was a relic from the 1950s, with long, echoing corridors and countless rooms filled with forgotten inventory. It was a quiet job, especially on the night shift, but Ethan didn't mind. He enjoyed the solitude, the stillness that the night brought. His shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., and the routine was always the same: patrol the perimeter, check the surveillance cameras, and ensure that the building was secure. Most nights, nothing happened. The warehouse was as lifeless as the boxes it stored. But one night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, something changed. Ethan was doing his rounds, walking through one of the many deserted corridors. The dim lights overhead flickered as he passed, casting long shadows on the walls. He had his flashlight in hand, more out of habit than necessity. The building was always quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. As he reached the end of the corridor, he heard a sound. A faint, distant thud, like something heavy falling to the ground. Ethan froze, straining to listen. The warehouse was massive, and it wasn't uncommon for old boxes to topple over, but this sounded different. It was heavier, more deliberate. He turned around, pointing his flashlight down the darkened hallway. The beam cut through the gloom, but there was nothing there. The sound didn't come again, so Ethan shrugged it off and continued his patrol. But as he moved on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt colder, thicker, and there was an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang over the place. He quickened his pace, eager to finish his rounds and get back to the security office. When he reached the next corridor, the feeling of unease intensified. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows that danced just at the edge of his vision. As he walked, he heard footsteps echoing behind him. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Ethan stopped and turned around, shining his flashlight down the corridor. The beam revealed nothing but an empty hallway, stretching into darkness. His heart began to race as the footsteps continued, this time coming from the direction he had just turned away from. It was as if someone, or something, was playing with him. Deciding he had had enough, Ethan started back toward the security office. The footsteps followed, growing louder and more insistent. He broke into a jog, then a run, the sound of his own footsteps mingling with the ones that pursued him. He didn't dare look back. He just wanted to reach the safety of the office. When he finally burst through the door, he slammed it shut and locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The small room was lit by the glow of the surveillance monitors, each screen showing a different part of the warehouse. He quickly scanned the feeds, looking for any sign of what had been following him. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The cameras showed empty corridors and rooms, just as they always did. But then, on one of the screens, he saw it, a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway he had just been in. It was tall and featureless, more like a shadow than a person, but its presence sent a jolt of fear through Ethan. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to be aware of the camera, but Ethan knew it was the source of the footsteps. He watched, transfixed, as the figure slowly began to move, gliding down the hallway toward the camera. It moved with an unnatural, fluid motion, as if it was floating just above the ground. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the radio to call for backup, but when he tried to speak, no sound came out. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by fear. He could only watch as the figure drew closer and closer to the camera until it was right in front of the lens. And then suddenly, the camera feed cut out, plunging the room into darkness. The monitors flickered, the screens going to static before one by one, they all went black. Ethan was left in the pitch-black room, the only sound the pounding of his own heart. Desperation took over as he fumbled for his flashlight, switching it on and shining it around the room. The beam revealed nothing but empty walls, but he knew the figure was out there, somewhere in the darkness. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, and he could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. Then, without warning, the door to the security office creaked open. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he pointed it toward the door, but he saw nothing. Just an empty doorway leading back into the dark, echoing corridors of the warehouse. But he could feel it. The presence was closer now, just beyond the threshold, waiting for him. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, his breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The radio crackled to life, emitting a low, static-filled whisper. The voice was faint, almost unintelligible, but Ethan could make out one word: leave. With every ounce of courage he had left, Ethan bolted for the exit. He ran through the darkened corridors, the feeling of being pursued growing stronger with every step. The footsteps were back, faster and louder, chasing him down the maze of hallways. He didn't stop until he reached the main entrance, practically throwing himself through the door and into the cold night air. Gasping for breath, he turned to look back at the warehouse. It loomed in the darkness, silent and still, but he knew he could never go back. Whatever was in there had let him leave, but he had no doubt that if he ever returned, it wouldn't let him escape again. Ethan quit his job the next day, leaving without a word to his employer. He didn't care about the paycheck or the explanation. All he wanted was to forget the terror that lurked in the shadows of that warehouse. But no matter how far he went, the memory of that night stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the darkness that sometimes resides in the most unexpected places. Lena worked as the night janitor at the Thompson office building, a towering structure in the heart of the city. The building, once a bustling hub of business activity, had fallen on hard times. Many of its floors were vacant, the offices abandoned, with only a few companies still occupying the upper levels. This made Lena's job eerily quiet, especially during her late shifts when the entire building seemed to belong to her alone. She had taken the job because it paid well and fit her schedule, but she couldn't deny the creeping unease she felt each night as she cleaned the deserted halls and empty rooms. The corridors, lined with old, flickering fluorescent lights, stretched out like endless tunnels, and the silence was oppressive. But Lena was practical, not easily frightened. She focused on her work, determined to finish her shift and go home to her small apartment. One evening, as she was cleaning the lobby on the ground floor, the building's security guard, Paul, approached her. He was an older man, gruff but friendly, and they often exchanged small talk during her breaks. "Hey, Lena," Paul said, his voice carrying a hint of concern. "You be careful tonight, okay? I've been hearing strange noises coming from the lower levels." "The lower levels?" Lena asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the basement?" Paul nodded. "Yeah, but it's probably just some rats or something. Still, just be careful if you need to go down there. The place gives me the creeps." Lena shrugged it off with a nervous laugh. She didn't plan on going to the basement if she could help it. The place was a labyrinth of dark, narrow hallways filled with old storage rooms, and she avoided it whenever possible. As the night wore on, Lena went about her routine, mopping the floors, emptying trash cans, and wiping down surfaces. Around midnight, she reached the 12th floor, one of the vacant levels. The offices there had been empty for months, their furniture covered in dust and their windows streaked with grime. The place had a musty, stale odor, like old paper and forgotten memories. Lena was about halfway through her cleaning when she heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was so soft that at first she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, a low, rhythmic thumping. She paused, listening intently, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. It seemed to be coming from below her, echoing up through the floor. Lena frowned, wondering if something had fallen over in one of the storage rooms, but then she remembered Paul's warning about the basement. A shiver ran down her spine, but she shook it off. She had a job to do, and there was no sense in letting her imagination get the best of her. Still, As she moved to the next office, the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just a thump, it was more like a dull pounding, like someone was hitting something heavy against a solid surface. It was a rhythmic, deliberate noise, each impact sending a faint vibration through the floor. Curiosity got the better of her. Lena grabbed her flashlight and headed for the stairs. She descended to the ground floor where the noise was louder still. It seemed to be coming from below, from the basement. She hesitated at the top of the stairwell, her heart beating faster. The darkness below was thick and suffocating, the stairs leading down into a black void. But Lena wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she descended, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the basement, and it was getting closer. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a long, narrow hallway, lined with old, rusting doors. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and mildew. The pounding sound echoed through the corridor, coming from one of the rooms further down the hall. Lena walked cautiously toward the source of the noise, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as she moved. She could feel the cold, oppressive air pressing in on her, and the silence between the pounding was so deep it hurt her ears. She reached the end of the hallway and found herself standing in front of a large metal door, slightly ajar. The sound was coming from inside the room beyond. Lena hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling her to turn back, but she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large, filled with old filing cabinets and dusty shelves. In the center of the room stood a massive, ancient boiler, its metal surface pitted and rusted. The pounding was coming from the other side of the boiler, a steady, relentless rhythm. Lena walked around the boiler, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As she rounded the corner, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure, a man hunched over with his back to her. He was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, his hands bloodied and raw as he pounded them against the concrete wall. The sound of his fists hitting the wall echoed through the room, a sickening, wet thud with each impact. "Sir?" Lena's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make the man stop. He slowly turned to face her, and Lena felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. His mouth hung open as if in a silent scream, and blood trickled from his cracked lips. But it was his eyes that terrified her the most, empty, lifeless, and filled with a deep, unimaginable sorrow. Lena stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as her hand shook. The man took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "No," Lena whispered, backing away. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She fled down the hallway, up the stairs, and through the darkened corridors of the building, not daring to look back. She didn't stop running until she burst through the front doors of the office building and into the night. She leaned against the cold stone wall, gasping for breath, her mind racing. When she finally looked back at the building, it was dark and silent, just as it had been when she started her shift. There was no sign of the man, no indication that anything was wrong. Lena quit her job the next day. She didn't bother explaining why. She just couldn't bear the thought of stepping foot in that building again. But even as she tried to move on with her life, the memory of that night haunted her. She couldn't forget the man's lifeless eyes, the sound of his fists pounding against the wall. And every now and then, when she was alone in the silence of her apartment, she would hear it again, a faint rhythmic thudding echoing through the walls, as if the man had followed her home, still trapped in his endless torment.